do not let fear distract you from what that gut is telling you, because you can have fear about doing something that is still the right thing. That fear is not something that means it's bad, or that means it's not the right thing for you. Safety is not always, when it comes to our careers, we're told, like, do no harm, do safe things, like don't take risks, basically. But I think that, in order to grow, we have to take risks, and that fear is this kind of this primal thing that's telling us to tread lightly, but it doesn't mean that it's not the right path for you. And even if you don't end up going on what ends up being the right path, like, it's still a journey.
You are listening to the Pinnacle Podcast, where we empower women in medicine through education, community, and actionable strategies for both the practice and the business of medicine.
Medicine is a lifelong career, and continuing education is crucial for professional development. Pinnacle is the first and only multi-specialty organization dedicated to addressing the challenges that all women in healthcare face.
Welcome to Pinnacle, the elite professional community providing education for women in medicine. At Pinnacle, we challenge you to pave your own path by helping you develop the skills needed to not only stay in medicine, but to excel.
Welcome to the Pinnacle Prescription Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pamela Mehta, and today I am joined by Dr. Nadia Mostovych for the Mentorship and Burnout, Navigating Early Career Lessons and the Pivot to a Better Fit. Today, I'll be talking to Nadia about her experience in navigating some of her early career decisions that she made. Nadia is a dual board certified facial plastic and reconstructive surgeon based in Bend, Oregon, where she is currently establishing her own private practice. She had an early interest in medicine, which was sparked through her participation in competitive rhythmic gymnastics. This experience initially fascinated her in the anatomy and physiology of the human body. Nadia, it's so good to see you again. It's been a while.
You too, Pamela. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, let's start with that. Can we talk about your rhythmic gymnastic career
Sure.
and how that sparked an interest in medicine? I love that.
Yeah, so I had been doing gymnastics. I actually started out in regular gymnastics, went from like classes from whenever I was like, 4 or 5 years old. And then I actually entered team gymnastics when I was, I think, 8 or 9. Um, but even at that point, was taller than all the other girls. For those of you who know me in real life, I'm pretty tall. So I don't know why, but my parents at the time like wanted to look for another gym, and I had some friends who were doing rhythmic gymnastics, and they were like, "You should come here." And I was very early on in the competitive gymnastics field, like I was a level 5, which at that time was the lowest. Now it goes even lower. And they were like, "Oh, you could be, advanced to level 7." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I want to do this. I want to be higher. I want to be better." So I did that, and then I competed in rhythmic gymnastics until about age 16. And yeah, I did it pretty intensely. For people who don't know, rhythmic gymnastics is really like a combination of um, traditional gymnastics and more of the like dance and lyrical aspects of it, as well as ballet, and incorporating 5 different apparatuses as the different events. So there's no bars, beam, vault. Instead, there's just the different apparatuses, which is a ribbon, hoop, clubs, ball, and rope. So it's actually a lot of hand-eye coordination plus, ballet and gymnastics. So, yeah, so I did that competitively for, I guess, it's losing track of time, but I guess 7 years. And that was like my life. And I had basically small injuries that happened that affected me. As with most sports, many people do suffer some kind of issue. And so I was exposed to the field of orthopedics. And, I just remember looking and seeing like my x-rays. I had some like ankle and hip issues. Um, Fortunately, nothing serious. I never needed surgery or anything like that. But at a pretty young age, like 11 or 12, I was found myself in the orthopedist office and was like, wow, this is such a cool job. Like, this is so cool. I get to look inside my body and see my bones and how they work and how it affects my sport. Um, and I just thought it was really cool to engage with the physicians. And I thought what they did was really inspiring. So that's what actually motivated me to go into medicine. And I thought I was going to go into sports medicine or orthopedics. So that was it's funny how um, that is, or ortho is where you ended up. And I remember listening to one of your podcasts, how you originally thought you might do OB. And it's just so funny how we think one thing and then we go through the whole process and it isn't always what we thought it was going to be. Um,
Oh, it really is, especially since you're an athlete and most colleagues of mine are played competitive sports at some point or continue to be athletic. I
yeah.
am not. I play no sports. I'm very awkward and not coordinated when I'm outside of surgery, which I
Well,
don't
let
like
me
to
say
admit.
this. I'm not coordinated for the sports I probably should have done, like basketball with my height, like basketball, volleyball. I didn't do any of that, and I'm not good at those.
Well, yeah, it is interesting how we gravitate towards a specific field while we're in medicine, and I often wonder how much that has to do with us being women as well.
hmm
For me, I just had a terrible OB experience at the program I was at the medical school I was at. And I believe that the men that were there had a better experience. And so they probably gravitated towards OB doing that rotation than say I had, whereas my ortho experience was pretty awesome. So that's why I ended up doing that. But tell
Yeah.
me more about how you chose the field of ENT. I would love to hear about that.
Yeah. So I think I always knew I wanted to do surgery. I liked working with my hands and just the idea of, you know, not that whole God complex thing, but we're just really changing something and you feel like you have that sole responsibility to be able to transform a change for a patient. And I felt both very inspired and empowered by that. Um, and just kind of the act of doing, just like doing sports, like using my body. I think it's the same thing in surgery. You're using your body to do something. And so I often found, parallels between kind of getting into that zone that we sometimes find ourselves in sports, also happening in surgery, where you're just completely consumed by what you're doing. Um, so I had always been drawn towards surgery, but I wanted to keep an open mind. I kind of interestingly was turned off by orthopedics in medical school, partially by it was just very competitive, and I didn't feel ready to kind of, be doing all the research from day one and kind of sucking up to all the professor. Like there was just this um, culture about it that I didn't like, not necessarily related to the specialty, but it was something that a lot of people came in wanting to do. And so there was just this competitive vibe about it that I didn't like. But I kept an open mind and I still had the rotation. I always did love kids, so I wanted something where I could treat both kids and adults. And I wanted the variety of both maybe being able to take care of somebody who's really sick or has cancer, and also something that's just kind of an everyday or very common problem for many people. Um, and so when I was in my surgery rotation, I loved everything, but I really found myself being drawn towards ENT because kind of really the anatomy of it. I'm a very detail-oriented person, and I did love ortho hand. I was very close to
It's a
considering
good
ortho
one.
hand. Yeah, it was just incredible to me. But I loved kind of that intricacy of the anatomy of the head and neck and just kind of um, it was just so complex and so interrelated with multiple specialties. We worked with ophthalmology, derm, neurosurgery. It was just so um, fascinating to me on multiple levels. And I also enjoyed the colleagues that I interacted with there. Um, and it was kind of something that, I was thinking about lifestyle. Everybody in medical school, especially if you're a woman, they're like, don't do surgery. If you could see yourself doing anything else other than surgery, don't do it. I feel like everybody's heard that who's a female thinking about surgery. I
Yeah,
knew I wanted to have a family. And so, that kind of came into it as well, because I thought, well, ENT does have, the potential to, like, if I don't want to be doing all the big head and neck reconstructions and the very intense surgeries at an academic center, you can have somewhat of a more controllable lifestyle where you're not just dealing with emergencies or extremely sick patients all the time. So, I had kind of thought about ENT and urology because the urology folks were also great. But my preference was to deal with the upper part of the body. I enjoy my patients clothed and kind of clean and neat. Um, and so that became a pretty easy decision to stay towards the head and neck region. Um,
That's why
yeah,
I didn't pick urology actually
yeah, no,
either. I was
I was like, I
deciding
can't do
between
this.
ortho and urology. I was like, I don't know if I want to look at that body part day in, day
No,
out for
and
the
I'm
rest
so
of my
happy
life.
that I I just feel like now granted, dealing with a lot in ENT, I don't deal with this anymore, thankfully, too much, but tracheostomies and a lot of saliva, we do deal with a lot of secretions, just different sorts, but
Yeah.
um I decided that I would rather deal with those than the other
Absolutely.
side.
So, a couple things that you brought up that I would really like to reiterate to our audience here is that the experience you had at your institution may be different than an experience someone else had at a different institution, meaning
Sure.
you thought the ortho people at your institution maybe were very gunnerish, it was
Yes.
competitive, had to do a lot of research. And maybe the colleagues that you saw in ENT were a little bit more your style or vibe. So I think
Yeah.
that is a really important point for our listeners, especially the younger ones, is to recognize that each specialty is different at each institution, and your experience may be different than somebody else's at another place. And to
Totally.
not necessarily rule something out or rule it in for that reason. And I think that especially applies to women in surgery because we are told what you said is try to find a specialty that will give you some work life balance. And if there's anything outside of surgery that you enjoy, please do it. And so some of that commentary isn't incredibly helpful to
No.
women and what their passion may be.
Yeah, and I did, choose to I didn't completely rule it out, but, I think when I started medical school, that transition was hard enough. I felt like I already had enough on my plate. Like I just couldn't do anymore. It was just I was already doing everything that I could without doing extra shadowing and extra research and all of this stuff. And I took my first summer between because that's like your last summer between depending on where you go to school. I know some programs have um, their schedules are a little bit different where they might start second year or third year rotations earlier, or second year classes. But we still had like a 12-week summer after first year and in between second year. And I chose to go volunteer at the Ukrainian summer camp I grew up going to, had a family vacation with my family. Like, I didn't want to spend that summer in a lab. And that's just me. I still I'm happy that that's what I did. But like the vibe that I was feeling was like, well, I'll never get into ortho or something like this if I'm not spending this summer in a lab. And I hadn't really known about ENT at the start of residency. So, maybe again, depending on the program, maybe that would have been the vibe at that program. I decided relatively late, I decided to pursue ENT in my definitely decided by the start of my fourth year, my kind of end of third year, start of fourth year. But we had an ENT program. I know some places don't even have certain access to programs, so it
Yeah.
definitely can be really hard. I did still do an ortho rotation, and again, I had 1 week in the third year. It's so hard. We don't get a lot of exposure to the
Really
subspecialties.
difficult. Agreed.
And I remember seeing hand and loving it, but the other thing I remember was really just being like in this hip case with some kind of nail placement and holding a leg for a couple hours. And I was so bored. Whereas with ENT, I was like in there helping retract and they're showing me all the anatomy of I just, again, I was just so much more involved. And so who knows, maybe if it would have been a different exposure to ortho. I did think about it here and there, because I do miss it and I do have that still as an interest, but um, I do think I ended up landing somewhere where I'm well
Sure.
fit for the type
Well,
of work
well,
I do.
that is another pearl for our listeners is that there are usually multiple specialties you can end up with and be very
Yeah.
happy. I do want to pivot now to discussing, maybe let's fast forward through your residency and talk about your first job and how you got
Yeah.
to it and how it was and where you are now.
Yeah. So, after residency, so I decided to pursue a facial plastic surgery fellowship. And at the time of pursuing that fellowship, it's interesting. I really loved the blend of art with facial plastic surgery. I've always been passionate about art. And again, it's interesting, kind of a lot of um, some of the things I struggled with maybe had been with internal narratives that for whatever reason I developed at some point in life, right? So as a kid, maybe I thought being an artist wasn't going to be a career that would be sustainable for me or wouldn't be something that I could earn a living doing. So that was never even entertained, right? But I loved photography, I loved painting. Um, and so when in my medical training, I saw kind of how that artistry was a big part of facial plastic and reconstructive surgery. I really gravitated towards that. Um, and so I pursued that fellowship, but I thought, oh, I'll still do general ENT. But kind of to get the fellowship, I had to be like, no, I'm only going to do facial plastic surgery. And it's funny because now that is actually all I want to do. Um,
I
so
love
again, it's
that.
just so interesting how our what we think we want can shift and the more exposure and experience that we get. But anyway, so I did a 1 year facial plastic surgery fellowship. They are accredited by the American Academy of Facial Plastic Surgery, which is its own accrediting body. So it's only 1 year after an ENT fellowship or ENT residency, I'm sorry. Because we do already do a lot of facial plastic surgery in residency, especially in the program that I was in. It's a big part of ENT. And during that fellowship, you know, typically the options after that, if are that you could, some people just go out and start their own practice right away, which is overwhelming and tough and expensive and takes a lot of time, as I'm learning right now.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to know that you almost want to do that before you even start fellowship. Another option is you could stay in academia where you would likely be able to probably practice more of just facial plastic surgery because in academia now so many of our attendings are fellowship trained and some subspecialized. So, they're probably going to be doing a greater portion. Um, or you can find an employed position either in what I did was a multi-specialty group or with an ENT practice. With ENT practices, I was always kind of discouraged against it if I wanted to really dedicate my practice to facial plastic surgery because they often want you to still do ENT and because they don't necessarily have a big volume for facial plastic surgery just on their own to kind of support you to just do that. It's usually something that you have to grow over time, whether you're joining a practice or you're starting your own practice. So a lot of people who join ENT practices may practice 50-50, maybe it's 70-30, it depends. And they often are also taking, ENT call. Um, I wasn't very interested in doing a lot of ENT at that point, even though that was what I initially thought I would do is just join an ENT group. So the multi-specialty route is because facial plastics does kind of um, lend itself to work with other specialties, specifically dermatology, ophthalmology, and general plastics, like a plastic surgeon who doesn't perform any face procedures. That sometimes you'll find kind of these blended practices or multi-specialty practices where you will have either ophthalmology and plastics or ophthalmology derm plastics or just general plastics and plastics. So I had kind of been looking at either joining another facial plastic surgeon to kind of try and be like a junior. That was kind of what I wanted to basically be like the junior person with another facial plastic surgeon to have a mentor and then be able to ultimately become a partner and then, see where the wind takes us kind of thing. But I had a really hard time finding that. And I also had a hard time just kind of finding people who are in the position of their careers who are ready to take on a junior person and also ready to like really collaborate and support that junior person. Because again, when we come out, and if you're trying to do exclusive facial plastic surgery, which would include like aesthetic and or reconstructive plastic surgery of the head and neck, again, like there's still not necessarily a ton of volume. I mean, they have to be so busy that they're ready to bring somebody else on or be ready to actually give away some of their volume. Um, and I found that really hard to find, especially because, um, I don't know if this is, the majority of the people in my field are males, and there's a lot of male, especially, those who have been around. And it
Sure.
just depends on the personality. So I don't want to say it's a gender specific thing, but it is a field where many people are out there on their own because there is a lot of competition and they kind of have to prove themselves and get themselves to the point of really developing that patient base. And then it almost seems kind of like hard for them to give that up. It's not saying that it doesn't exist. It definitely exists because I have plenty of colleagues who are in wonderful or what seem to be wonderful partnerships with other facial plastic surgeons, some of them male, some of them female. So it definitely does exist, but it is hard to find. Um, so I ended up finding a position with a multi-specialty practice back in Maryland, which is where I'm from. And my husband was based in Maryland for work at the time. And this was in a rather like not a multi-specialty type of like big, insurance company type of group like Kaiser or some of the other, bigger healthcare systems. So not like that, like a smaller group with about six physicians, and it was blending um, ophthalmology, dermatology, general plastic surgery, um, and then they had like a wellness component and an aesthetics kind of, injectables type of thing. Um, and then they didn't really have a facial plastic surgeon. And so when I had approached them, which I had to do a lot of the approaching, like if you Google facial plastic surgery jobs, like there are none.
Yeah.
So it was very
Well,
challenging to find a position.
if it
Um,
doesn't exist, you just have to make
yeah,
it
you have
happen.
to. So it was a lot of cold calling, putting myself out there. And so this group had been initially looking for a dermatologist, but I think they kind of saw how, with what I did, I could kind of cover some of the aesthetic dermatology needs that they were wanting to fill. And they didn't really have anybody to do rhinoplasty, which is something that um, is really kind of our um, one of the things that we shine on in facial plastic surgery because we have the experience from ENT and then the plastic surgery training and compared to many people who undergo traditional plastics training, we get a lot more of that in our residency. Again, it depends on the program and where you go, but just because we're not splitting our time doing plastic surgery of the rest of the body, we're dedicating it all on the head and neck. And so we
Sure.
typically are doing more of that, and you'll find many general plastic surgeons who will do other aspects on the face, but they won't do rhinoplasty. So this group didn't really have somebody to do rhinoplasty. So that was kind of the niche where I fit in. Um, and so it seemed great. And they were like, oh, yeah, we'll help you build up your practice. But it was a really unique situation. And I didn't really have any other offer. So I did have an offer from another surgeon actually out in Oregon. And basically, when I tried to negotiate with him some things that I felt were important for me in the contract and kind of was asking more about how I would grow there, um, it ended up getting shot down. So, so that went away. And this was all like this was like in June of my fellowship year. So I, am finishing training and I don't
And you
have a
need a
job.
job at this point.
Yeah,
Yeah, you need
I
a
was
job.
freaking out. It was
Of
June
course.
of 2018 when I was finishing my training and I didn't have a job. And so I was like, well, I have this other offer and my goal at the time had been like, I really want to just practice exclusively facial plastic surgery. Um, in order to get our board certification, we have to practice for 2 years. So every specialty is kind of different, but I know like in ortho, especially if you do I'm not sure how it is for just regular, but if you do a fellowship, I mean, you have to prove your cases and that kind of thing. And so for some of the
Correct. We
surgical
have oral
specialties,
boards too, and our
yeah,
fellowships are all 1 year long. And as we also have to go do cases in our specialty if we want to be board certified in that specialty. I'm a generalist, but I
okay.
understand what you're
So you
saying.
didn't have to do
Correct.
that? You didn't have to do the cases and everything after
I
just the
did, but
test?
in
Oh, you
general
did?
orthopedics. I did
Okay.
general orthopedics. Correct.
Yeah, so for just general ENT, like I was board certified at the end of 2018, which was the year I finished in 2017. We take written and oral boards over the course of the following year. And when you pass that, you're certified. Like you don't have to show for any cases. But then with facial plastics, I had written and oral boards as well in the fellowship year. And then we had to work for 2 years and submit 100 cases, 50 cases per year that then get submitted. But the nice thing is that we don't have to like defend the cases, I think like you guys do. So
We do. We have
we,
to
we
go to a place and defend, I think it's like
yeah.
6 to 10 cases. Correct.
Yeah, yeah, I have a good friend who's a foot and ankle, and so I remember hearing about that. So we don't have to do that, but we still have to, do the cases. And the cases are supposed to be basically exclusively in facial plastic surgery. There's a couple things, like they count a couple of the general ENT procedures that are more of the head and neck procedures, but for the most part, I was like, well, I need to get my board certification. I need to do it like right on time, and because this is what's going to help, credential me, and propel my career. And so anyway, so that was one of my main goals, and this job afforded that, and it also seemed to give me a lot of flexibility of how I would be able to practice. It also had the facility was beautiful, had an on-site surgical center, so that kind of mirrored what I had in my fellowship. So there were a lot of great positives that seemed to be there, and that really were there throughout the experience. And I did get my cases, I did get my board certification, and I did learn a lot. Um, but I also felt like I didn't have any other options, and I wasn't confident enough to be like, oh, I'm just going to finish fellowship and not have a job, like,
Sure.
or do locums. My program director in residency was like, you don't want to do locums. Like, that really looks bad.
Yeah, I think that's another great
Yeah,
point that I want to reiterate to our listeners is that a lot of these academic institutions where you train have an idea of what it looks like to be a successful surgeon. And
hmm
they often want you, A, to do a fellowship, B, to take a stable, sometimes academic job versus taking some time, doing locums, trying to figure out what works for you.
yeah,
And
exactly.
ultimately, when you're finishing training and you're finally out in the real world with a real job, there's a lot more you have to learn than just the medicine. And that is kind
Totally.
of what you've touched upon too, is the competitive nature of ENT and some other kinds of surgeries or surgeons, and needing to understand that sort of entrepreneur business side of medicine that we don't get taught in residency or medical school, and understanding how to make a living from your career as a surgeon as well. But why don't you tell
Totally.
us now
And
what
knowing
went
about your
what
options.
absolutely. So why don't you tell us now, I don't want to say what went wrong in that job or what were
Yeah.
sort of the indicators that maybe this wasn't going to be a long-term position for you.
Well, the first thing I'll say is I knew I didn't want, I was already thinking about leaving before I signed the contract to go. So
Oh
that's a red
no.
flag
What
number one.
yeah, what happened there? Tell us that.
I just didn't have like the gut feeling that it was going to be the right fit long term. And it was for a couple reasons. And I think I felt like I felt like I had to have a job. So I didn't feel like I couldn't not take it and do locums and basically give myself more time to find the right fit because I felt like that was a failure. I will also say that I was probably in a pretty low point of burnout at the end of my fellowship and was probably in a really difficult place for me personally, like that I've ever been. And so I probably wasn't coming at this whole process in the best mind frame that I could have been, or the strongest mind frame, but we can touch on that later. Um, it's hard to say. It's a gut feeling. I didn't have a good feeling. Some of it could have been just with kind of I had talked to all the people who had worked there and just kind of how they said about certain things of like, well, make sure everything you want is in the contract because if it's not in there, and I mean, this is how it is in the real life. Like I tried to negotiate that really well, but there were still certain things that I didn't negotiate for that I really didn't even completely understand the implications of at the time of the negotiation.
That's a
Um,
really good point there, too. We don't know what to negotiate for because we haven't been out in the real world yet. So we don't even know what we should be asking for.
and I guess there was just kind of like this feeling. I mean, it's hard to say. It was just this feeling of how like I just wasn't sure that it was going to be the right long-term fit. But part of that also came along with the fact that I had always dreamed of living on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest. And the job that had been in Oregon that fell through was in Oregon. And there was a lot of kind of personal and family um, drama and emotions about us leaving. And so it was kind of almost like I felt like I was settling for the job, even though, like, I do want to say that I did, I wouldn't be where I am today had I not taken that job. So I don't regret taking the job. And I did gain a lot from the job. But for example, there was no like path to partnership with the job.
They
Um,
made that clear from the beginning.
yeah, and I knew that. And I
Okay.
knew, and I always kind of felt like I was going to want to have my own practice. Like in fellowship, I was in, as I was interviewing, I was starting to feel like I wanted my own, but I just didn't have the confidence to do it. I didn't feel like I didn't have the surgical confidence, number one. And even now, after 4 years, like I have that, but it's still like, it's still hard.
Oh, I
And I
tell
just,
people all the time or young students, that it takes at least 5 years to feel surgically confident. And there's another 5 years where
yeah,
you
I'm sure.
do question certain things, you replay things, you're still studying. So it's really that first 10 years of a surgeon's career before you feel super uber confident, where you're worried more about what music is playing in the OR than
Yeah,
what instruments and what you're doing that
totally.
day.
Um,
Okay,
but
so
yeah, so
take us to when you started the job.
yeah, so we
And
started the job, and I mean, I basically, you know, so I guess in terms of starting the job, so certain things were different than what I was told. So I was told I was going to like be the facial plastic surgeon there, and I was going to build up the program. Um, and and then when I get there, they were like, "Oh, well, we actually this other physician is joining us now more not full time, but he's going to be our lead for facial plastic surgery." And I was like, "Wait, what?" Like I thought that was going to be me.
wow,
That ended up being so I was upset about that initially, but that ended up being such a blessing. He was like he was just a godsend because he was the one who helped propel my practice there. So he shared cases with me. I mean, he used to work in academia. He was um, later in his career, basically wanting to slow down, but not quite ready to retire. Loved to teach, but left academia because he wasn't, you know, I think he was just done with it after a period of time. Um, and he was incredible. We would see consults together, we would operate together. So that ended up being a complete like blessing. But it
that
was
is
still,
so important. You have to have some sort of colleague or camaraderie
yeah,
with either one surgeon or multiple surgeons when you're starting out as a surgeon. You cannot go at this alone. It's just
right.
not possible. And so you need somebody to bounce ideas off of, ask questions to. Don't feel that you're being judged for asking those
Hmm.
questions. So that sounds like a silver lining, and that was
That was a
great.
silver lining. He was incredible, and he really did the most to help propel my practice because he basically was like, "I have a patient who, needs a facelift. I'm going to do her facelift, but why don't you go talk to her about her eyelids?" And so then I would do the blepharoplasty, and then he would be like, if they need fillers or anything like that, why don't you take over their care? I mean, he was just so generous, so going about, and again, this is a male surgeon, older in his career, but it was an amazing fit and opportunity, and he was an amazing teacher. And I'm so grateful that I had that. So had I not taken that job, had I gone out on locums or decided to start on my own, I wouldn't have had that kind of mentorship experience from him. Um, so that was wonderful. But, kind of where kind of some of the issues that came up was I really thought like one thing that you don't realize, like So this job, I was not salaried. That was another thing, which I knew, but I kind of had this expectation that like, oh, I'm going to be busy and I'm going to this big multi-specialty practice where they're all going to feed me, you know? So even though they didn't have like patients waiting for me, I really thought that that would grow faster. And they said like, oh, we're going to market for you. We have this huge like injectable patient base that comes to see our nurses. But yet I was like, well, I want to do those things too. And how are we going to split that up? And so basically, like, I never kind of felt like it was always sometimes hard to know, well, how are my interests and like how I want to grow my practice? How is that going to fit into how everything is that they're already doing and that they want to do? You know, and the dermatologist did send me a lot of patients as well. He was amazing. He also helped to really grow my practice. And the ophthalmologist did too, but the other plastic surgeons didn't really send me that much, even though they didn't really do that much face stuff. But there just kind of wasn't a ton that came from them. And for example, like they didn't advertise, like a ton of people who were going to see the nurse injectors, like had no idea that I was there for like 2 years. Like they didn't
Yeah.
put up a sign and say like, hey, and maybe I should have done more to kind of, you know, the way that they phrased it was like, you know, we're here to support you to help build your practice. But the way that I took that was like that they're going to do potentially a little bit more, even from an internal standpoint of trying to do those cross referrals. But yet I felt like there were competing interests internally, and that didn't necessarily come across
Well, you,
always.
you bring up another good point of these are kind of the expectations that need to be outlined a little bit better when negotiating a contract and discussing the actual job because we don't
Yeah.
know to ask for those things. We don't know that, you know, I know a common question now that would ask or advise someone to ask is ask how the patients get put on your schedule. Is it, you
Hmm.
know, is it a round robin situation where it's equally distributed? Do they look at the payer before they schedule the patient? Are you getting more complex, complicated patients than
Oh
the
yeah.
other surgeons? These are all questions you would never know as someone in training. And I think that's why we need to highlight that learning and getting this mentorship from people who've been through it is really important.
Right. Like for example, with and you know, I would always go back to these injectable patients, but they're kind of like the stepping stone to developing surgical patients because that's how people get to know you and get comfortable with you. And I would always ask them, like, well, what if, you know, they're like, well, a lot of patients are already established with the other ones. I'm like, okay, well, what about the people who are new? And they're like, well, a lot of times, like, they're already calling because somebody else. I'm like, well, fine. Someone who just calls, like, can those people go on my schedule, you know? And I could never get a good answer, and I could never get a good protocol about some of those things. So that was one frustration. But kind of the bigger picture was that, like, I was ultimately responsible for my own salary. And then another thing that I didn't really understand, so I signed this in the contract, you know, so they only paid, this was a W-2 employed position. I was not 1099. They only paid 50% of my malpractice coverage, um, unless I earned over 500,000 in revenue per year. If I earned 500 or more, they would pay, I think, all of it. And I'm looking at that number. I'm like, well, and this is gross revenue. It's not take home. I'm like, oh, well, most doctors make, you know, and my take home pay was 40%. So I got 40% of my gross collections. So I was like, okay, 200K or 250K, like that's like average doctor salary. Sure, no problem. Like, let me tell you, I never made that much until like my third or fourth year.
Oh,
And
wow.
I've been making only slightly more than a resident, and it's like very sad, and I'm still bitter. But, you know, in some ways, it's like, well, yes, was that all on me because I was growing my practice, but yet I didn't really have complete control over all aspects of how that practice was grown. And, you know, I would always go back and forth like, well, if I grow and I earn more money, like they benefit as well, right? Because they're taking 60%. So why wouldn't they want me to grow, you know? So I can't necessarily say, that, they were trying to limit my growth because that doesn't make sense. But yet, when I think about, for example, how much revenue a nurse injector would bring in and the cost of a nurse injector, that revenue uh, profit is much higher than it would be for me, who's more expensive. Um, so anyway, and I don't have control over all those kind of little steps. So who's answering the phone? I found a big disconnect from the people who were at the front desk because they were all managing all of the specialties, and there's a lot of turnover in that position, and that exists everywhere. I haven't gotten to the point of hiring my own staff, but all my colleagues who are running their practices, like that's everybody's biggest challenge. And so,
Absolutely.
that's not their fault, but it's a challenge that exists when that's the first, phone call and they're making scheduling errors and, just not necessarily telling the patients, they don't know what I do. They sit in a different room, like down the hall. They have no idea, about what I do and how I process things and how I treat my patients and what's important for me to know or what's important for the patients to know. Now we did have surgical coordinators, so they were awesome, and they did do a good job. But it sometimes happens that people oftentimes are calling for something non-surgical, but they really need or want surgery, but they're just like not ready for it, or they might say no, and then when I'm seeing them, it's like a totally different
Of course, that
conversation.
happens all the time. Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
So, having a disconnect between kind of ultimately being responsible for my pay and then part of that malpractice insurance, but not really having control over all of those steps. And where I'll bring up the malpractice insurance, so I didn't get to choose my insurance. And again, this is one of those things that you're like, I don't know, you don't think about it because you've never had to pay for malpractice insurance. Like in residency, they just get it for you. And then like these tail policies. So I didn't negotiate that like I would cover, I didn't negotiate for them to cover my tail if I left. And I knew that I would have to pay it if I left. And I thought, well, whatever, my malpractice policy is like 10,000. So maybe the tail will be, I mean, that sounds bad, but okay, whatever. And what I didn't realize was that your policy increases every year. And what I also didn't realize was that depending on who you're insured through, it can make a significant difference depending on which state you live in, and that different states have different rates for malpractice policies based on their, um, I don't know, litigation histories and how litigious the state is. So Maryland is an extremely expensive state to practice medicine in. I learned both in the fact that like their insurance reimbursements are lower and um, the malpractice policies are much higher because it's, I guess, a more litigious state. And I think they don't have a cap on what they can sue. I don't know all the details, so don't quote me there. But basically, your malpractice rate will depend on the company you get it from and where you practice. And had I known those things, basically by my third year, my malpractice policy was up to like $46,000 a year. No, I've never had a claim, thank God, no, nothing. This was just the standard policy with the company that they chose, and I was responsible for half of that. And and that came out of my paycheck after. But it wasn't tax deductible for me or anything because um I'm W-2. And yeah, so I didn't know this. And I
So
was
it
like,
sounds like
what?
the entire setup of the practice was a situation where you had very little control.
Actually, I had very little control about things that ultimately affected my bottom line.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
that
which was
is,
huge.
but that is a hard thing to understand if you have no experience in
Hmm.
practicing medicine outside of training and understanding the business side of medicine, which is not
Totally.
talked enough about. So, even you talking about practicing in different states, many people would not know that. And there is no handbook to figure that out, which is
No.
why these kinds of conversations are so incredibly important so that people at least know what questions to ask. Because if you know what questions to ask, then you can at least get to scratch the surface of some of these answers. So
Right.
what took you, what was your breaking point?
Oh gosh. Well, so I started practice. I don't even know, man. It took me a while. I think I broke much earlier than I don't even know. There's some, I mean, I had basically, I think, yeah, it's so hard to even figure out the breaking point because it was for so long that I didn't feel great in the
Okay, so it was a
situation.
lot of little cuts. It wasn't
It was a
it
lot of
wasn't a
little stuff.
massive
It
stab.
wasn't a massive stab, but it also I start, and this is the other thing that is so hard, I think, for so many women physicians, especially if they're planning to have families. But we basically delay so many things in our career. So I finished in 2018, got married in 2018. I basically gave myself 1 year to like get used to the job, and we had fun, we traveled. Like the benefit is I had, I accepted like the no guaranteed salary, but I also had a ton of vacation, right? So I didn't make a lot of money, but I could have worked more if I really wanted to, you know. But I had a great year in 2019. And then 2020, I got pregnant with my first child and COVID hit. So some of the salary issues and I think some of the challenges I experienced with that growth were also situational by what was happening in the world and what was happening with me and my own family. So in 2020, I really only worked a total of 7 months because unfortunately my baby didn't turn out to time with, the lockdown or anything. So
Sure.
for better or worse, right? Um, so we were shut down for 2 months, and then I came back to work in like mid-May, and then I delivered my first child at the end of August and took maternity leave, which was all unpaid, no benefits. So my
Wow.
salary of that year was like a resident. It was so sad. Um, and I mean, there were so, and then I had started basically in 20, and then I had my first baby, and that's a huge adjustment, right? So like I wasn't ready or thinking like I'm gonna leave this job right now. But in 2021, I had started to kind of like look for other jobs. And I think at that point, I still wasn't quite ready to kind of like make the leap on my own. I was still trying to see if I could find that other perfect situation, which there is no perfect situation, but I just kind of still wasn't looking out, finding a job. But that was also the year that we had our Pinnacle year-long amazing
Mem-
mentorship.
membership.
Yeah. So I think kind of over the course of that year, I was like, okay, I had gotten pretty frustrated by the end of 2021 when I was applying for jobs, and I just felt like everyone again, they had happened to be male, but I was like asked about my future family plans and how much I wanted to work, and I just kind of felt like I couldn't get like they didn't understand my value. And I was always kind of chosen by some other male colleague or for the position. And I just got fed up. I was fed up. I would say that was kind of like the breaking point in the idea of not necessarily like the breaking point in my job, but the breaking point of being like, you know what, like I can be in control of my career and take the steps that I want by doing my own thing, and I'm gonna do it. I just need to like figure out how I'm gonna do it. So I would say by the end of 2021, that was kind of where I was just like, okay, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna plan my own practice, and like we're gonna figure it out. We had also decided that we wanted to make to go for moving across the country to Oregon. And so there was kind of a lot of moving parts. So I would say, you know, I didn't quite just jump off the cliff. Like I didn't have this like hot heated moment where I was just like, I'm done, I'm out of here. It was very calculated because I was also, I was worried about potential repercussions for leaving. I wasn't sure how this like malpractice situation and this tail was going to work out, what I had to do. And I also knew I wanted to grow my family, and I knew I was going to, I wanted to try and do that, and I wanted to try and time things around a maternity leave again, just because with respect to leaving, I knew I was going to have to stop kind of operating and seeing patients, or not necessarily seeing patients, but stop operating a period of time before leaving because I just wouldn't feel good about both you can't abandon patients and I mean that was the hardest part for me was leaving my patients and my coworkers. I did really love my coworkers. Um, so when we got pregnant with my second child in early 2022, it was like countdown, clock's on. Because I basically knew as soon as I delivered that baby, I was giving notice and leaving that job. Um, and So then, it had just taken a lot of time and personal growth to like get the courage to say, okay, I can do this. Like I can leave and figure it out. And, my plan was to do locums while we were planning to relocate, and then while I started working on starting my own practice. Um, and I think there was just so much fear of the unknown, but I think I had gotten to that point where, there was just so many little things, and I wasn't happy going to work every day. I dreaded going to work every day.
That's terrible. That's not a way to live after we train for
No,
so many years.
yeah, and I wasn't even getting paid well. So it was just like, I was like,
Yeah.
when I was starting to look into locums, I was like, okay, so I could work 1 week a month and earn the same amount of money, basically.
Yes.
Um,
Locums is
and
not something to pass over so quickly. I think it's a really
yeah,
good option for people in
to
transition or even a
totally.
supplementation as we're building things. Okay, so
Right.
tell us where you are today. Where are you today and how is this a better fit for you?
Yeah. So, where I am today, so we moved across the country last year to Bend, Oregon, and I am in the process of starting the practice, which it's crazy because I feel like I've been doing it for a year already. It's not taken me forever to find office space, but I'm finally in the process of negotiating a lease, and I've been approved for a bank loan. Um, and I would say, I'm where I am kind of the bigger picture is I'm taking steps towards this goal and this dream of mine that are really scary steps, and there's a lot of unknown with it, but I'm still doing it anyway. And I think I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that 4 years ago. Um, and so, I hope it all works out. Like I hope this lease, I'm getting back there with the lease negotiations and being like, oh, I hope they don't, I need to negotiate for what's important to me. And I want to, I'm kind of thinking about what I didn't negotiate in this other job contract. And this is a different situation, but it's still like, I hope I don't miss something that screws me. And, I think I'm just taking those bigger steps, even though there's a lot of the fear and uncertainty that goes along with it, but it kind of feels just like right in my core. Um, and I'm doing locums work. I've been doing that basically for a year now to kind of keep us afloat financially. I'm getting sick of it, personally because it's just hard. It is doable, but it's really hard with young children and leaving them, and the travel is hard on me, but it has afforded me a lot of flexibility. Um, and yeah, that's where we are. So kind of that's where I am now. Hopefully, my practice will be open by the end of the year, early 2025, and I'll finally be able to start, doing what I love again with patients and seeing patients. But it has taken a long time, and I do think it'll all be worth it. I feel better because I'm in control of this, and I'm not in a
Absolutely.
situation where I'm. I mean, there's definitely still discomfort. There's definitely still discomfort in things that are really hard, but I'm not in a situation where I feel like I don't feel well when I'm out of control. At least like there's certain things that I can control. For example, like one of my locums jobs is ending and I'm annoyed because I kind of waited and they basically haven't told me if I can continue and passed up other positions and now I'm like shoot, like now that was a better position and now I have to find something new and maybe it won't be what I want it to be, but it's ultimately still my choice. Like I it's not necessarily always fun. Like if I have to take a job where I have to take more call, I don't want to do that. But, if I have to, that's my choice and I can do that. Whereas
I
like
think
I
that's
couldn't do
very
locums in my last job to make more money. Like it wasn't allowed.
I think that's a really good point too is the power of choice. And
Yeah,
for a lot of women, that's very important. For some, it's not, meaning they're okay being employed and being told who's
right.
going to be on their schedule, what their call schedule is going to be like for the entire year. Some of the issues that you were discussing with scheduling patients and malpractice. But other people want that control and want to feel that they're making a decision in those,
Right.
they're making a choice in those decisions. So,
Like for example, just a quick tidbit about the malpractice, had I known that if I was leaving, so again, in hindsight, like, had I known that the malpractice was going to go up to almost 50,000 a year, and then a tail costs typically about 1.75 times your premium. So a tail for me, I was quoted at like 85, $90,000 to
Wow.
leave my job that paid me less than that some years. Like that to me was just like mind blowing. And I was just like, this is insane. Like this is just crazy. And if I had known when I was signing that contract the tail could be $100,000, I'd be like, absolutely not. Or I'm covering my malpractice, like it was kind of the worst situation. I'm like, you either be W-2 and they give you everything, right? Guaranteed salary, they're responsible for patients, they pay for malpractice, or I'm 1099 and I choose everything, at least for me. But
No,
that's
but
because I
you
didn't
bring
understand the implications.
this is another great point because I think that's why there's been a real growth of employed healthcare managed organizations because they have figured out that doctors are frustrated with the type of situation you're talking about. So they've sort of taken over everything. That has its
Hmm.
own problems too,
Sure.
but at least it's all one stop shop. Okay, so we are coming to time. I would love for you to share your pinnacle pearl with other women in medicine and also maybe talk a little bit about where you hope to be in 5 years and what you may want to share with the audience at that time.
Oof. Yeah. I know. I feel like the pearl would have come to me. But I mean, from a pinnacle pearl, I would say, um, this is going to sound so generic, but well, first of all, everyone says trust your gut, and that is 100% true. And I would say do not let fear distract you from um, what that gut is telling you, because you can have fear about doing something that is still the right thing. Like fear does not have to be, that fear is not something that means it's bad or that means it's not the right thing for you. Safety is not always, when it comes to our careers, we're told like do no harm, do safe things, like don't take don't
Risk.
take risks, basically. But I think that, in order to grow, we have to take risks and that fear is this kind of this primal thing that's telling us to, tread lightly, but it doesn't mean that it's not the right path for you. But, and even if you don't end up going on what ends up being the right path, like it's still a journey. I don't know, it's very generic, but I think for
It's
me, so
not.
many of my decisions were limited and based on fear. And I unfortunately kind of feel like I had grown up in a very fear-based thinking philosophy household. Um, and that really limited me in many ways. And I think that, affected my self-confidence. And, in some ways, my therapist always says this. She's like, you gain confidence by learning from your mistakes or, being in a challenging situation and growing from it. And I think in medicine, there's such little room for errors and mistakes that we feel like we can't make any. Um, and I think that can actually hinder you. So yeah, that's my pearl.
I love that.
Um,
And I think that is really important because also we are on a very straight trajectory in
yeah,
medicine. And like you said, you grew up in in somewhat of a fear-based household. I have a feeling that has something to do with the immigrant household you were brought up
yeah,
in because it's similar to me. But in medicine also we are taught not to take risk. We're very risk averse. And
hmm,
so that doesn't really line up with any out of the box thinking and how to conquer this broken healthcare system we're in. The fact that you're
yeah,
paying more for malpractice and tail than you're making is a problem. It's
yeah,
so it's so complex that most people do not understand it, which is why it's not being fixed. And the people that are making these sorts of laws and running these companies don't even understand exactly what's going on. So Where do you hope to be in 5 years? What do you want to tell our audience as kind of a closing? And
Yeah,
also, please do tell people where they can find you because I'm sure we're going to have
sure.
many young women reaching out to you.
Oh, totally. And I'm happy to talk to anybody. So in 5 years, well, I hope that I'm running a profitable practice with my loan
Yes,
paid off.
let's manifest it.
Yeah, manifested so busy I need a partner. Um,
And
yeah, so
you have all of the power when it comes to control and choices.
yes, yeah. And I mean I do feel like I have that now. So that is good. Um, but yeah, I really just hope I feel a little bit more stable in my career because I've really struggled from the financial aspect because of kind of how the last 4 years have gone. So for me, it's almost like I finally want to get to that place where I have a thriving practice. We can really start to enjoy some of those aspects of just like not worrying about every little thing when it comes to like, oh no, we have to pay for like 50,000 in childcare, like,
Sure, yes.
those kind of things. So I'm still in that phase of like survival mode with young kids. But I would love to be speaking at Pinnacle and, sharing the wisdom from the last 5 years. And honestly, so exploring other interests. So I don't know if it'll happen, but when I went through this journey, um, I definitely did a lot of personal growth and I've always loved yoga, but another amazing like silver lining or pearl, when I joined that job, I there was a gym nearby and they had yoga classes that were like in the mornings and the gym was literally like 2-second drive. So it's like, oh great, I could go to yoga before work. And it was just like a yoga class within a gym. And I was like, I don't think this is going to be anything amazing, just it's not a private studio or anything like that. She happened to be the best. I went to class and I was like transformed. I'm like, this is the best yoga teacher I've ever had. She was amazing. I have
Amazing.
since gone on 2 yoga retreats with her. And it was just, it was a big part of my like healing journey in the last, in that time especially. And so I had thought like I would love to do a wellness retreat for physicians, for women physicians, and kind of like bring her in and bring in other things that I've kind of delved into. Like I do acupuncture now, and I started meditating, just like lots of self-care stuff because we all need it. And to talk about, she had a lot of journaling prompts. Like the retreats were very powerful and transformative for me. And I was like, all women physicians need this, like
I love that.
stat.
That's
So I
great.
had this dream of creating this retreat.
All
It's on
right.
hold right now. I'm one business at a time, but
You got time.
maybe
So
in 5 years that would be awesome.
you got time. We're going to
Um,
see you thriving in your practice on stage at Pinnacle and running your own retreat. I love it. Okay, tell
yeah.
our listeners how they can find you.
Um, you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Nadia MD. So it's just Dr. My first name Nadia Nadia MD. Or you can email me. My email is just my first name dot last name at gmail.com, nadia.mostovych at gmail.com. That's probably better. I've been on a little social hiatus until I'm getting once I got my lease signed, I'll show you all the progress deets. But right now I'm on a little bit of a hiatus. So email's better, but I do still check it occasionally.
Awesome.
Um,
Laying
yeah,
low. Laying
yeah.
low to show
Lots
all
of
the
other
things.
things happening in the background right now. So a lot to come soon once it feels like things are even more in motion.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nadia. It was awesome chatting with you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
you too, Pam.
Thank you for listening to the Pinnacle Podcast, where we strive to elevate the voices of women in medicine and inspire excellence across the healthcare landscape. Until next time, keep reaching for your pinnacle.